We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for? Those masters of the universe are at it again.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center, and the U.S. Border Patrol recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. And so I thought it would be good to have on two former chiefs of the Border Patrol to talk some about what the past 100 years has given us, maybe what the next 100 years we can expect, that sort of thing. So we have with us Rodney Scott, who was chief of the Border Patrol, came up through the ranks of the Border Patrol, was in there for close to 30 years. And also Mark Morgan, who was chief of the Border Patrol, who had a long career in other law enforcement agencies and came in. So in a sense, kind of two different perspectives, sort of that of a lifer who came up through the Border Patrol and one who came and saw it sort of from the outside and became chief. And I thought those would be two interesting perspectives. So Rodney, why don't we start with you? You were there, if you were close to 30 years, so you were there about 30% of the entire existence of the Border Patrol in some sense. I don't know, any thoughts on the Border Patrol's 100th anniversate?
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Mark. That kickoff kind of makes me feel old now that I think about it. But it's interesting. I've participated in several different events over the last couple of weeks celebrating the centennial of the Border Patrol. Border Patrol has officially became a federal agency, or an office actually kind of within a federal agency back then. On May 28th of 1924, I was part of the Department of Labor, but you talked about like the history and how things go. I just gave a couple speeches on this because it depends on where you sit, what you see, right? But as you look at the whole history of the Border Patrol, the day in and day out duties have changed a lot. Sometimes driven by politics, sometimes just driven by the threat of the day. But the mission of the Border Patrol really from day one was to simply protect America. And it still is that today. Initially, it was set up to protect America by protecting Americans' jobs. A lot of Chinese immigration back then were seen as threatening U.S. jobs. But Border Patrol was under the Department of Labor. And then it actually moves into, or they create the Immigration Naturalization Service, and it moves into the Department of Justice later. And it's always, even till today, had immigration authority. So that is the foundation. But I remind people, it wasn't anything about, anti anybody. It was literally controlling who and what enters our nation so that we can protect American interests. Fast forward, 9/11, changed things dramatically just as far as focus. But you know what? The day in and day out duties of the actual Border Patrol agents in the field really didn't change. How they do their job changed. But the fact that they're out there every day protecting America, trying to make sure that anybody and anything that comes into our country actually comes through the front door and is not allowed to sneak in between the ports of entry. That part of the job, fundamentally it stays the same, protecting America. And I think that gets missed a lot in the public dialogue, if you will, because everybody focuses on like a sub-issue like immigration or narcotics. But really, it's all about just protecting America by knowing who and what comes in. And then to kind of close us out, how they do that, and this is the cool part, if you look back at Border Patrol, it literally started out on foot and on horses. And then, as technology, everything changes, how we patrol the border changes. But today, there are still Border Patrol agents out patrolling on horses.
Right.
Because, technology closes some gaps. Jeeps, ATVs, everything else are used. But it's really kind of cool that original legacy is still there. And it's not because of nostalgia. It's because it's the best tool for the job in some areas. But yet, they also are using high-tech drones, technology, intelligence, cooperating with other agencies around the world to try to make sure we know who those threats are coming in. I don't want to overly simplify the mission, but it is cool that a lot of the original functions, still exist today, just, almost identical when it comes to the horseback.
Right.
I'm interested in Mark's take a little bit too, though.
No, I'm going to get to you, Mark, but I just wanted to underline the point you made about, it started out in the Labor Department, then it moved to the Justice Department, then it moved to Homeland Security. And in a sense, we actually started to need a Border Patrol 100 years ago, because before that, how could you even get here? In other words, it was almost like we would have had a Border Patrol earlier if there was some way to actually get across the borders. But, we got oceans on either side, and there's just, Canada's not that big a place, and it's not that big an issue. And before the 20s, certainly in the 19th century, and the northern Mexico was basically empty. I mean, I remember reading, they did a census, I think in 1900 in Mexico, and Tijuana had 200 people in it. The whole city had 200 people in it.
Yeah.
So it was really as the world shrank that something like the Border Patrol became necessary. So Mark Morgan, you were also head of the Border Patrol. You came in from FBI, and you also, when you were in DHS, then did some other things. You were acting commissioner of CBP, which is above, sort of oversees the Border Patrol. So what is kind of different or unique in your experience about what the Border Patrol does as opposed to other elements of law enforcement? Or is it the same?
Yeah, I think that's one of the neat aspects of the Border Patrol, and this is Rodney just described. Oh, by the way, Rodney, you are old, and so am I.
Yeah.
But I think, Mark, you hit on something. There is no other federal agency in the United States that has the authority and mission of the Border Patrol. And again, Rodney did a great job of just kind of walking through what that is. So that itself gives Border Patrol, I think, this unique characteristic, this unique culture and aspects of what they do. And I actually think, and go with me here for a second, I actually think that me coming from the outside, I have this different perspective, and I think it's a good perspective in the sense of I had no, I think, preconceived notion either way about the Border Patrol. And so when I was assigned as the special agent in charge of the FBI's El Paso division back in 2011, that's really the first time that I got to see Border Patrol in action. I actually lived and worked on the border. I used to say from my office, I could actually see Juarez from the window when I would arrive every single morning. And during that time I was there, Mark, and Rodney, you've heard me say this multiple times, is that I saw just organically, I saw the dedication, the commitment of the Border Patrol. I saw that they shared kind of a similar culture with respect to, God and country and mission and themselves. It actually reminded me of my time at being a United States Marine. And over time, it just, again, kind of organically happened for me. They gained my respect and my admiration. And I tell you, during my time at El Paso, I was hooked. And so then years later, when kind of the stars lined up and I had an opportunity to put in to be the chief of the Border Patrol, for me, it wasn't even a question. People say, well, why did you want to go be the chief of the Border Patrol? And my response is, who wouldn't want to be chief of the Border Patrol? Who wouldn't want to be a part of this great organization? Rodney, being Rodney, so he's talking about the positive stuff. Not to be negative, but I think there's a realistic side to the past 100 years. And what I've seen, but in some ways it actually, I think, speaks even more highly of the Border Patrol, is that I've also seen 100 years of just bad policies, bad policy, bad law, and bad politics. And Mark, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but as far back as 1918, I think one of the inspectors there was commenting about the lack of resources. And then we go forward, 1927, I believe it was, the Secretary of Labor at the time was actually calling for amnesty. And from that, there was actually calls for his impeachment. The irony is, here we are, almost 100 years later, and we have another secretary, right, that's doing essentially the same thing, and he actually was impeached. And so I think what I've seen over the past 100 years is this continuation of bad politics, the lack of political, courage, strength, and will that decade after decade has made the Border Patrol's job more difficult, more divisive than at any other time. But yet somehow they still are able to succeed. They're still able to get up, as Rodney said, every day, pin the badge on their chest, holster that gun, and still go on the front lines protecting our nation. And that's the reason they will always have my respect and admiration.
Well, there's a question about that I wanted to direct to Rodney first. In a lot of law enforcement, everybody you're dealing with at least everybody you're trying to, apprehend or whatever, they're all bad guys. Now, they may not be the worst people, but they're dealing drugs. They're beating up their girlfriend. They're doing something. Whereas the Border Patrol has to deal with some people who are clearly drug dealers and really bad guys, and some of them are just ordinary working stiffs. You know what I mean? And so it seems to me a little bit different and poses kind of a challenge, not a big challenge, but at least to some degree a challenge for agents, because some of the people that they're dealing with who are lawbreakers are, not super unsympathetic. I mean, they're not dealing drugs or setting, fires illegally or whatever it is you're dealing with in law enforcement. Some of them are sympathetic people. So how do you guys deal with that? I mean, you were an agent on the line too for many years. How do agents kind of square that circle?
Yeah, it is. I'm glad you really bring that up, though, Mark, because it is challenging. Because you think of the different missions that Border Patrol has, or even duties, if you will. Now, I don't want to skate over the fact that literally entering the United States illegally in between the ports of entry, in and of itself, is a crime.
Absolutely,
violation
right.
Of 8 U.S.C. 1325. However, everything you just stated is true. Over my career, you would have actually a lot of migrants, I will call them, until they hit the border, as soon as they cross, they're illegal aliens.
Right.
But you would have these illegal aliens that they didn't really understand that aspect of it, nor did they necessarily understand that their participation in this illegal activity is actually complicit to significantly larger crimes, because the cartel, and I think a lot of Americans don't even understand this, the cartel now, especially way more than, obviously back in the 20s, it was organized crime, but not to like it is now. The cartel uses the illegal aliens to shape the border, overwhelm law enforcement, and then bring in a second wave.
Right.
The second wave is the real criminals that don't want to be fingerprinted. They either know and or believe the government has information on them, or it's the narcotics or whatever else. But the agents in the field, when they're taking down a group, in most cases, you just don't know. So you have to go in assuming that you are taking down armed narcotics smugglers or potential terrorists that want to come into the United States that don't have any hesitation to kill you or do harm. However, you got to be able to flip the switch very, very quickly when you realize that you just caught the first wave.
Right.
The first group that the cartel pushed over, they don't know. They're surrendering. They're going to try to claim asylum. They're still going to try to abuse the system. And there's all kinds of issues. We can talk about that. But that's actually, I would argue, part of law enforcement everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's police officers right now as we speak that are pulling over a vehicle on the side of a highway for fairly minor traffic infractions, speeding or whatever. But as they walk up to that car, they don't know if that is a mass murderer. They don't know if the guy's a convicted felon. They stole the car. So all law enforcement really is trained from day one to make that shift pretty quickly. But Border Patrol has to do it with a group of 50 to 100 of people at a time. The cop on the side of the road does it with an individual. So there is a unique challenge in the Border Patrol environment. But then again, that's what I love about the organization and the culture. They are making that shift as we speak right now. Agents in the field just went from a very high intensity. You can never let your guard completely down because it usually is large groups. But they've reevaluated, and now they're separating people out. The ones that they think may pose a risk, get put over here in a smaller group with one or two officers, agents. The family groups or whoever kind of get put to the side. And I think they do their absolute best at treating everybody how they deserve to be treated. And what I mean by that is the criminal many times sets the stage. The officers react to the threat that they see in front of them or the demeanor of the individuals. And I think Border Patrol handles that situation as good, if not better, than any organization on the planet.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree.
Yeah. Do you mind if I jump in on
this? Please.
I think this is, I think you ask a very critically important question. And again, I agree with everything Rodney said. I think he laid it out very well. And it's kind of a phrase that I use to sum it up is that I think this is an area where our compassion has been hijacked.
Mm-hmm.
Illegal immigration is not a victimless crime. And I was a cop too. So I was a cop at LAPD. And to kind of flip stomp on something Rodney just said, an example, DUI. So I pulled somebody over that was driving while intoxicated. Now, the individual could be a good person, right? Never committed a violent crime, is a good, upstanding, maybe a husband, father, but had too much to drink. But why do we enforce that law? Why do we try to stop people from drinking and driving? Why do we make sure that we actually apply consequences that those that drink and drive? Well, the reason is because Americans die every single day from people driving while intoxicated. So DUI is not a victimless crime.
Sure.
There's a downstream negative effect. It's the same thing with illegal immigration, as Rodney just outlined. When you have illegal aliens come in, even those that are good people, right, it pulls those resources off the front line, as Rodney talked about. It leaves large areas of our border unmanned, unpatrolled. The cartels gain and expand operational control, increases their operational capacity, ability to push drugs, criminals, and national security threats. So that's why we say illegal immigration is not a victim of crime. That's why the numbers matter, because it pulls those resources off the front line, leaves our borders completely wide open and vulnerable to a vast, complex set of threats. And the last thing I'll say about that is, and we talked about it before, and I know Rodney and I talk about this a lot too, the strongest border security hawks that want to stop illegal immigration, and there shouldn't be a single person allowed to illegally enter our borders, we also fully support legal immigration. Those are two different things. They are not the same. And I think a lot of people get that confused. And I'll steal a line from Rodney, and I'll shut up, is that's why we keep saying is that border security is synonymous with the national security, and illegal immigration is not a victimless crime.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen. So a question for you, Rodney, to continue on this idea. You know, you pull over a drunk driver. He maybe isn't a bad guy, but, you know, made a mistake, but is endangering other people. I get all of that. But also, one of the things that Border Patrol did not have to deal with 100 years ago, didn't even really deal with 20 years ago, frankly, not even very much 15 years ago, is kids coming across. And that's, you know, mostly a consequence of bad policy that then the Border Patrol, they deal with the consequences of bad policy. And that's broadly speaking, not even just with the legal incentives we have for people to smuggle children in, but also really any immigration policy that is frankly not very good. The Border Patrol is almost like the last one that has to deal with it, because they have to basically clean up the consequences and face them. How do agents think about this issue of dealing, especially with kids, but just generally that they're the cleanup squad for mistakes coming out of Washington?
Yeah, I'm going to start with that real quick. Thank you for bringing that up, though, because I do remind people all the time when you get into this conversation bigger or broader, right, and it can go on forever. Bad policy makes it nearly impossible to secure the border. Good policy alone doesn't secure the border. It has to actually be done by agents, and we have to support it with infrastructure and funding and everything else. So we need good policy. But bad policy is a cancer. It makes it impossible to secure the border. And this is one specific area, man, we could go on forever. But I think the first piece that people really need to understand, and Americans have a really, really hard time with this, kind of going back to Mark's, you know, our compassion being hijacked. A juvenile, an unaccompanied alien child, and from many different countries is not the same as the kid next door to you. They've been forced in a lot of these other nations to grow up a lot faster. So, you know, a 14 or 15-year-old kid that lives down the street from any one of the people listening right now, maybe very, very highly likely is very, very different than that 14 or 15-year-old that we're arresting from many countries around the world where they've been on their own, working on their own. So that in and of itself is a dynamic that's very challenging. But by the way, we also catch 15 or 16-year-olds that are very similar to the kid down the street. So Border Patrol, not only do they have to separate the boys from the girls and deal with all those issues, and then have higher levels of care and guidance for juveniles, which wipes out resources. Now we literally have to keep 15-year-olds away from other 15-year-olds because their culture is so different. It's literally almost the equivalent of putting an 8-year-old with a 17-year-old. And then, whether we like to admit it or not, a lot of these different nations hate each other, and they don't like their cultures. And, you know, we talk about racism in the United States. It's a joke compared to a lot of these other nations where it really truly does exist. And then you infuse in on top of that, the gangs. So the gang factions, these are all the things Border Patrol has to deal with to try to keep individuals safe once they're here. But here's the number one thing that we really wanted to look at and we're getting better and better at, that is now completely been obliterated by the chaos on the border. Detecting child trafficking. Because literally a lot of these kids don't know they're being trafficked yet, to be quite honest. So it makes it very difficult for agents to identify the threats associated with child trafficking at the border. You're not going to scan their fingerprints and have them pop up on some global missing child database. Not how it works. It doesn't exist. So it requires a face-to-face deep dive interview to find cracks in the story between the adult guardian, if they came as a family, or if they're a kid, to figure out, is their story true, or was it given to them and did they have to memorize it? That requires agents having conversations. But the mass illegal immigration we're having today prevents agents from having that kind of time. So in my gut, it just tears me up that I know I can't say for a fact, but based on my experience, I know for a fact that child trafficking, unrecognized child trafficking, has had to have gone through the roof during the last few years of this chaos. And then on top of that, and I don't want to get into politics really, but for some unknown reason, the Biden administration shut off a program we were building out called rapid DNA testing.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that, at least with the family groups, allowed us to find cracks in their stories that, hey, there's no DNA relationship. Did you adopt this kid? How did you get him? Allowed us to ask questions. But that program got shut down, and agents don't have time to do interviews now. So these children, literally, that's when Border Patrol agents say they shifted from a law enforcement role now, or they feel like they have, to being babysitters.
Mm-hmm.
That's why. Because before, they still had to interact with children, but it was in a different way. It was trying to figure out what's going on, how do we protect them? And then now, again, as you mentioned, and thank you for bringing this up, Border Patrol, by definition, kind of like a uniformed police officer out in the field, 90% of the job is reactive. You as leadership want to shift that so that you get less and less of your workforce just simply reacting to other people's crimes, and more of your workforce focused on proactively preventing crime.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, today, because of the total chaos, 100% of Border Patrol's resources are focused on reacting to criminal activity that already took place, to including the UACs. So they're not able to actually go out, do those deep dive interviews, figure out where the child trafficking is taking place versus somebody being reunited with family that was already here or whatever else is going on. But we are really putting more people at risk today because of this chaos than in centuries.
And the same thing, you're talking about how the scale of it makes it impossible for agents to actually, you talk to the kid and you say, is this really your dad or whatever? In other words, ways to sort of tease out. The same thing you hear from people who were focused on national security threats, because, people coming from Somalia or Syria or whatever were relatively rare and would allow either the Border Patrol or other law enforcement and time to pull them aside. You grill them, download their phone, whatever it is, to see if they're a national security threat. But when it's like Lucy in the Chocolate Factory and it's just never ending, there's no way to do any of that sort of in-depth examination of what's going on.
Correct. If I can touch on that real quick, and I think Mark did a ton with the JTTS, I'd like to hear his perspective. But after 9/11, I just gave this speech last night, but after 9/11, I actually got pulled out of the field and I got put on a task force with a bunch of 3-letter agencies to figure out how, as a nation, we could attack this terrorism problem a little bit better. And the first part of it was literally I realized I had even undersold Border Patrol's mission, like how important it is for national security to simply be able to control and make conscious decisions about who and what enters the country. But as we were able to put deterrence mechanisms in place, border infrastructure, and slow down the chaos, the flow at the border, if you will, the United States Border Patrol, well, you as taxpayers really provided funding to do significant training for Border Patrol agents to enhance their ability to do deep dive interviews, to detect deception, to identify techniques to basically be able to get online and cross-check people's stories, whatever the threat was, whether it's a UAC, whether it's a fake family, or whether it's a terrorist threat. And then we actually participated and joined all the joint terrorist task forces with FBI across the entire nation and basically built this process where we could do exactly what you said. Step one, the agents in the field could do an interview, because not everybody is in that national terrorist database. Not everybody's fingerprints are in there. So you need to be able to say, hey, as a trained agent, something doesn't seem right here. I'm going to flag this guy, send him off to the side where the JTTF can do a deeper dive interview before we decide where he's going. We don't have time to do any of that now. Not only is the time gone, all that wasted investment is gone, because a lot of those agents that we spent years building that expertise, they're frustrated and they're retiring early. So we are literally hemorrhaging wisdom at the same time that our border is hemorrhaging criminals and potential terrorist threats to our nation. But Mark, his whole background, even I think that's how he really got to know Border Patrol a little bit, was that alliance of how we were working together to actually attack these problems as a holistic government or whole approach, if you will, as opposed to individual agencies. And that's kind of gone, unfortunately.
And this is, I guess, Mark, I'd love to hear from you on this. The Border Patrol, this is the 100th anniversary of the Border Patrol. And over time, you develop a certain institutional knowledge, and sort of more experienced agents will train new agents. Whereas what we're seeing now, doesn't it kind of, and this, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Rodney, too, but doesn't it represent a kind of discontinuity, like a interruption of that process of transmitting the knowledge that isn't going to be in a book, that you have to actually do, in person, learn? Is almost like apprentices. I don't know. I don't even know if the Border Patrol uses the term apprentice, but in a sense, a new agent is an apprentice. He has to have somebody to learn from. If everybody's retiring as soon as they can or going to get a job at some other police department because they can't take it anymore, don't you lose that institutional memory and that transmission of expertise and knowledge?
Yeah, so there's really two very important things that are going on. One, as you just said, there has been a quite a large sucking sound of experienced agents. And so anytime an agency, and this is the first time the Border Patrol has experienced it, and there's other law enforcement agencies that have gone through this as well. Back in 2002, 2007, 2008, the Border Patrol hired a bunch of additional Border Patrol agents. And now all of a sudden, like, the supervisor to new agent ratio was not optimal. And that created a lot of challenges where we've kind of the same thing happening now, just a little bit in reverse. And so you are getting a younger cadre. So yeah, that's always going to impact the overall operational effectiveness. But here's what's more important, I think, and I'd be curious to hear what Rodney has to say on this, is what these new agents are learning. Rodney just outlined when you have a manageable flow of illegal alien at the border, what the process should be. It should be a intelligence-driven, threat-based, operationally focused, proactive mindset and strategy. Again, after 9/11, the FBI, for example, and then most agencies, transferred from that reactive law enforcement mindset only to that plus a proactive, again, intel threat-based, operation-focused entity. And I believe the Border Patrol was doing the same thing and getting better at that every single day. Well, now what you had, besides, the big sucking sound of experienced agents leaving, what you have is a Border Patrol that their core mission to secure, defend, and protect our borders, their law enforcement and national security mission, has been supplanted with a new mission, that being a processing enterprise. So you have some new agents now that they're for 3.5 years, all they know is this. They know just reaction. They know only to process someone who illegally entered, babysit them, give them food and clothing, and process them and release them out the back door, rinse and repeat, and do the same thing. That proactive, intelligence-driven national security law enforcement mission, there's a majority of agents now that have never experienced that. So I think that's actually more detrimental. So when you get a new president into the White House that understands that border security is synonymous with national security, I think there's going to have to be a resurgence and a reemergence and possibly retraining some of these new agents that's all they've known. And I'm curious what Rodney has to say about that.
Yeah, any thoughts on that? Because Rodney, essentially what Mark is saying is that the new agents, they are getting training, they are sort of learning, but what they're learning is kind of the opposite of what the Border Patrol is supposed to be doing.
Correct. And I think Mark touched on a lot of like the big picture stuff and the things that, if you're outside the Border Patrol or even inside to a certain extent looking in, and Mark and I have actually had this discussion as well too, from a kind of a selfish standpoint, as a prior chiefs of the U.S. Border Patrol, we're also very worried about their safety. Mm-hmm. Because you talked about, and I talked about before, that flipping the switch from the criminal to just the economic migrant that's going to comply and doesn't really have an individual personal threat to you right now. That is what these new agents are being trained to do daily. They're literally being told by this administration and by all the public media that every single person crossing the border illegally is just an asylum seeker, mm-hmm. and they deserve your compassion, and you should be nice, and you should process them. Where they're literally assigned, like San Diego right now, there's literally agents assigned to take water and food out into the field and to give to people that just cross the border illegally, but we don't have enough resources to take them to a station yet to process them. That's very different. I am very, very worried, especially these new agents. That's the only thing they were trained on. And in 4 or 5 years, or maybe another year and a half, when hopefully we get the border back under control, their mind isn't going to shift, and they're not going to realize when they're assigned to a canyon, and some of the leadership isn't going to have the wisdom to realize we never trained these people how to take down armed drug smugglers in a canyon by themselves with one other backup agent.
Right. Good point.
And all of a sudden, they're not going to be able to make that switch, and we are going to kill Border Patrol agents because we didn't set them up for success, because we had this naive, I would say some people very intentionally trying to misdirect America, that everything that crosses the border is just an asylum seeker.
Right.
It's
Mark?
dangerous.
And Rodney, to your point, and look, you and I've talked about this too, and I think you're spot on. Another issue is that they really don't know how to do a fundamental aspect of their job, and that's to be a collector of intelligence. That's to interview and interrogate individuals to actually find out, because we know that one of the many big lies being told by this administration is, as everyone we encounter, we properly and thoroughly vet them before we release them. We know that's a bunch of crap. We know that when you have individuals from 180 different countries, significant amount of those countries, we have no diplomatic relationships. For example, if we apprehend a single adult male from Lebanon, Cuba, Haiti, the list goes on, do you really think we're working with those governments to get their criminal background or their terrorist affiliation from their home country before we release them? Of course we're not doing. And again, Rodney said this multiple times, he's spot on, I couldn't agree more. Part of the bread and butter, again, when you're not having to deal with millions and millions of illegal aliens, part of that proactive national security mission is to actually talk to these individuals, actually interview them, and develop skills to be able to tell when somebody's BSing you and actually get more information that you're not going to get from a database system.
Right.
All that the past 41 months, Mark, it's gone. It's not happening. There's no interviews being done like there should be. There's no checks and balances like there should be being done. Their sole focus and their mission is process and release as fast as human possibly and repeat.
Interesting. Yeah.
Hey, just to dovetail on that, just so everybody knows, this isn't like hyperbole or like speculation. The performance metrics that are literally reported out every day by the U.S. Border Patrol to senior leadership now are all focused on that.
Interesting.
How much time have you had someone in custody? How can we speed up the processing? How can we reduce those in custody?
So the incentives are messed up, in other words. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Everything in the entire infrastructure has been flipped upside down to expedite the process and release of people, as opposed to identifying threats and stopping those threats to protect America.
Even the daily reports, because, Rodney was there, and sometimes Rodney would bust on me because I'm a numbers guy, but I mean, like one of the things, for example, to illustrate Rodney's example was gotaways, right? I used to hit him up all the time, gotaways, because that, of all the demographics, the gotaway, right? That's the demographic we know. Because why is there gotaway? Because most people turn themselves in. Well, we know that's where the criminal element lies, right? And so gotaways are important. The daily reports now have fundamentally changed. That's not even on there now. It's not even a concern from them. All they're concerned about is it's called TIC, time in custody, how many that are in custody, and how fast they're being processed and released.
Right.
As Rodney said, that's all they care about right now.
So we're getting toward the end. I wanted to hear from you, Rodney, especially since you were in the patrol for a long time as an agent. There's always been this idea on the left that the Border Patrol is racist and all. That's where that whipping lie came from back in Del Rio a few years ago about an agent on a horseback supposedly whipping but specifically related to Hispanic American agents. The fact is that I think it's half now. It used to be a third.
51%.
How much?
Yeah, 51%.
Yeah,
over 51%.
Are of Hispanic background, most of them Mexican, because a lot of them are recruited from the Southwest anyway. The recently retired chief who succeeded you, I think, Rodney, or maybe somebody after you, was Raul Ortiz.
Came after me. Yeah.
Right. And he's actually been kind of outspoken. He was on 60 Minutes, I think it was, and wasn't pulling any punches. So what's the feeling among either Hispanic agents or non-Hispanic agents about this sort of race issue?
So it's a stupid allegation, not to be too blunt, but it's a stupid allegation, but it's one that's easy to make and hard to defend against, right? But I'd point out what you just stated. Over 51% of the Border Patrol is Hispanic. But the Border Patrol, let's go through the history a little bit. It was originally created to save American jobs, and throughout time, it was part of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. And all of us that came in during that era were taught that one of the fundamental things we were trying to do was protect America's legal immigration system so that we could still be a country of immigrants and take the best and brightest from around the world and make this country excel so everybody has an unbelievably good opportunity to make their lives better. Border Patrol could care less about race. There's nothing that we do that has to do with race, but you know what we do? Nationality. And it's a huge, big difference, but if you're not paying attention, it's very easy to basically tell people outside that are too shallow to deep dive, to have a deep conversation about this. It's Border Patrol's job to identify an individual's nationality and then figure out if they have a legal right to be crossing that border or coming into the United States, while at the same time interdicting narcotics and everything else. But this is how I overly simplify it when I'm talking to the public. You own a home. Most people, everybody has a front door. Most people have locks on their doors and windows, or at least some kind of a latch. But most people, and this is globally, expect people to come to their home, come to the front door and ask for permission to enter. If anybody tries to come into your home, you don't care what color they are. You don't care how much they weigh. You don't really care anything about it. If you don't know them and they try to sneak into your house anywhere other than that front door, that elicits a response, and no one calls that racist. That is the United States Border Patrol's job for the United States. Patrol in between the ports of entry to make sure that no one sneaks into our home without going through a port of entry, one of 328 legal front doors to our country. There is nothing racist about it. The agents, thank God, they know, right? They realize it. A lot of them are first or second generation immigration anyway, so they're trying to protect that legal process. And they just blow it off as ignorant insults from people that don't understand the value that Border Patrol is providing to them. Or even a little more nefarious, individuals that do understand, but they have a utopian worldview. They don't really like America. They don't like border security. They think anybody and everybody should be able to go anywhere they want, which sounds great on paper, just doesn't really work in reality. They understand that there is that nefarious intent, and people know we're not racist, and they lie about it. So It's either naive or they lie. Either way, Border Patrol agents focus on their mission, go do an awesome job protecting America every day with the limited resources and crazy policies we give them. But I don't think they get too wrapped around the axle on it. It does get annoying, but they don't get wrapped around the axle on it.
Good to know. Last question for you guys. I'll start with Mark. Any thoughts on, this is sort of a blue sky question, but any thoughts on what the next 100 years might bring the Border Patrol, or should bring the Border Patrol, or what it might look like 100 years from now? They still going to be riding horses is kind of one question,
Yeah, so there's two sides to that, right? So the one thing is, we know what should happen, Mark. We've known over 100 years, but we've failed for 100 years. Again and again, when you look at a chart of the flow of illegal immigration in the past 100 years, every time there's a significant spike, there's a direct correlation to bad policy, every single time. In addition to that, there's also an element of the lack of anticipation of just how bad that policy is and what we need to do to respond. In addition to that, there's been a fundamental lack of resources, and for quite some time, really until 9/11, a lack of seriousness with respect to understanding that border security was synonymous with national security. So we've got to level set. I'm afraid that things are never going to get resolved because we've had 100 years where they haven't. Because right now, today, our country is more divided and the border is more political and more divisive than it ever has been in the past 100 years. So unless we can level set that, unless we can get past our ideologic and political driven answers and policies impacting the border, I don't know what's going to happen. Again, for Congress, and think about this, Congress again and again has failed. And it's not just a Democratic issue. We can't just blame the Democrats. Remember, the first 2 years under the Trump administration, the Republicans had the White House, the House, and the Senate, and they failed to pass a serious, meaningful border security piece of legislation that would have closed the significant loopholes. And it hasn't been done since. And again, we had an opportunity. They passed H.R. 2 in the House. It goes over the Senate, and it dies under Chuck Schumer. So unless we can get our politicians to actually come together and understand the seriousness and downstream impact to our nation's safety and national security, it's very likely we could have another 100 years of exactly what we've been dealing with.
Rodney, any thoughts? You still going to be riding horses 100 years from now in the Border Patrol?
I think we will, because in some areas it's the right solution at the right time. There'll probably be fewer of them, but I think we will. But I agree with everything Mark said. I have a little bit of an optimistic view. I just choose to have it. It doesn't mean it's rational. But here's my perspective as well. If you look, and I don't want to get too political, but if you look at almost any conversation and you look at the politics of it, one side is trying to just show America everything that's really going on the border so they can make informed decisions. The other side is trying to hide information from America all the time and tell them what decision to make. I'll let you figure out which side was which. But I believe truth and transparency, and thank you, Mark, for doing this podcast. I think stuff like this really helps. Truth and transparency win the day. And the truth is, border security is not racist. Border security is common sense, just like your home. And when we can have those adult conversations, even with people that have traditionally been pretty far on the left, most of my career was in California, I've had a lot of success at winning them over. But right now, unfortunately, we have a lot of work going into the other side, literally trying to hide information from America, tell Border Patrol personnel they're not allowed to speak publicly without a political appointee beside them, those types of things. We've got to put legislation in place that fixes that. Even before we do the immigration stuff now, I think literally we need to mandate true transparency in government and allow the government professionals, the border security professionals, to simply just tell America what's going on, publish information in a transparent manner so people can go to the ballot box with knowledge, facts, and evidence versus somebody's spin. If we can figure out how to get to there, and that's not easy, I think we win this whole thing long term.
Thank you. Rodney Scott, former chief of the Border Patrol. Mark Morgan was also our guest, former chief of the Border Patrol. We've been talking about the 100th anniversary of the Border Patrol, which was just recently. And so maybe if they invent some new technologies 100 years from now, we'll come back and talk about the 200th anniversary of the Border Patrol. But in the meantime, thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having us.
And finally today, as though to illustrate the point that Mark Morgan just made about border security being national security, it was reported initially by Jenny Terre in the New York Post that 8 nationals of Tajikistan who had crossed the southern border recently and had been let go were arrested in various spots around the country after it became clear, after they'd been released, that they had ties to terrorist organizations. At least one of them they know had crossed east of San Diego, like so many other people from China and the Middle East and elsewhere, and had been let go. And at least one of them had scheduled his illegal entry into the United States with the CBP-1 app. And they'd all been supposedly thoroughly vetted. And I believe that, the authorities ran their names through whatever databases we have and nothing came up. But this really does highlight, one, the limitations of vetting. When officials in the government are telling you somebody's been thoroughly vetted before they were released in the United States, you need to take that with a grain of salt, because it's not as though they're lying. It's just that, what does vetting mean? As Bill Clinton said back in the 90s, it depends on what the meaning of is. Well, it's dependent on what the meaning of vetting is. You run their name through a U.S. criminal database. Okay, they haven't been arrested in the United States. How many terrorists have already been arrested in the United States? It's a limitation of the systems you're using that is, unavoidable. So all kinds of bad guys are going to get through because our very limited ability to determine what somebody is up to makes it impossible for us to know. The other thing, though, is that it highlights the importance of detention, because these Tajikistanis had been let go, and then later it became clear that they were connected to terrorist groups, apparently some faction or factions of ISIS. Well, if they had been kept in detention, as is required by federal law, and as this administration is simply ignoring, then that information would have arrived before they had been let go. And so, this is, you don't just detain border jumpers as a deterrent to future border jumpers. In other words, to make clear that they're not just going to be let go. You also do it for simple security reasons. It enables you to actually find out more about who these people are before you let them go. So I would recommend to you, we'll have links in the show notes. I would recommend taking a look at these stories because they really do illustrate Mark Morgan's point of border security is national security. That's it for this week's episode of Parsing Immigration Policy. This is Mark Krikorian, Executive Director of the Center. If your podcasting platform allows you to rate or review this podcast, please do so. And whether it does or not, feel free to just email us at center@cis.org if you have any compliments, complaints, suggestions for future shows, what have you. So until the next episode, this is Mark Krikorian signing off.